casual. So given that, you are also all being recorded. So just wanted to make sure you're all aware of that. So any questions you ask, any choices you make to come onto video, you are being recorded, and just wanted you to be aware of that privacy piece there. So to introduce myself, I am Jamie Tates. I'm the CEO of Keystone Group International. We help organizations create impact at the human level. And we are a strategy firm at the same time. So we just take a very unique view to how you scale and grow businesses, looking at it from a leadership, culture, and strategy perspective. And that's really a big piece of what Mike and I are going to talk about today. And I'm really excited to have Mike on, because this all came about because of a conversation that Mike and I had. And I said, we need to have this conversation with more people in the room, because it's such an important thing right now. Mike's a seasoned technology executive. He's been a CIO in both the public and private sector, which I also think is just really unique perspectives. And he has a deep passion for helping organizations understand how to balance that challenge of digital transformation, technology, but also like how it can benefit your business versus just be a thing you need to do. And so that's what you're going to hear us talk a lot today about: change, about what digital technology and transformation really means. And so again, we want this to be free form. So if there are questions that come up, please let us know, jump in, ask the questions. And then I'll make sure you have contact information for both Mike and I at the end of this. All right, Mike, you ready to go?
Let's go.
Let's do this.
Let's do it.
So to start the entire dialogue, I think it's important for us to define digital transformation, because this is a term that is just like culture, right? It's becoming this buzzword, but I also think there's some misconceptions in how people define it and what it actually is, and actually what it's becoming, right? As we look at the future, which is, you're kind of more of the futurist. So how would you define digital transformation? How do we need to be thinking about it?
That's a great question to jump off. And as with so many other things, you ask 10 different people and you might get 15 different answers, definitions on what this is. And with anything technology, we tend to overthink it. But I think the simplest way to think of digital transformation, it's the effect that occurs when organizations implement technology to change how work gets done. That could be a process for communication. It could be a process for better operations. It could be a process for solutions delivery. It could be a lot of different things in there. But anytime that an organization utilizes technology, you're going to get a resulting transformative effect on that. And that effect happens procedurally as well as culturally within organizations. Unfortunately, and we'll dig into this certainly over the course of this conversation, but unfortunately, too many times organizations will focus on the technical side, the technical transformation that's happening, as opposed to the cultural transformations that are happening within their organizations.
Yeah, I love that. So a lot of people don't know, actually, I started my career in technology. So I was at Cargill for 13 years in technology globally. And when I was in technology many eons ago, it was a necessary evil, is how I would describe it, right? We weren't yet at the point, we were just becoming, business partners a little bit, right? But technology was the thing we had to have, not the thing we wanted in our way from a business standpoint, right? Obviously, that has changed dramatically. How are you seeing technology, right? The use of it, the enablement of everything happening in business. How are you seeing that evolve as the business environment evolves?
Again, I think we tend to overthink it. We make technology kind of a black box for a lot of people. As, I don't know this, I don't understand it. But at the end of the day, technology is a tool, period. That's all it is. It's a resource. It's a tool for, as I mentioned just a moment ago, for organizations to change or evolve how they get work done. Now, some organizations will do that, I don't want to say haphazardly, but we'll do that without a plan. And while other organizations will figure out ways to strategically leverage how that technology is going to help them move forward. I think a great analogy with regard to technology is, I've said this, I've used this analogy before, is like technology is to organizations what hammers are to home building, right? Home building is not about hammers, but you absolutely have to, it's an essential part of home building. And if we think about technology, there are certainly organizations that are in the business of technology. They're selling it, they're producing it, they're delivering solutions along those lines. Most organizations are just in the business of using technology. But again, as I just mentioned, if you don't have a plan, if you don't wrap a strategy around it, it could end up becoming a risk or even a liability. And certainly it can become an impedance to whatever the organization is trying to do. A lot of times the organizations will try to implement technology under the premise that this is going to make it, become more effective, more efficient, more economical. But then without a solid strategy of how that's going to work, not just from an implementation standpoint, but we'll get into this later, but adoption and integration. If you don't have that strategy ahead of time, you certainly, like I said, it could become a risk or a liability, but definitely an impedance to trying to move the organization forward.
I have had this conversation no less than 5 times in the last 2 weeks, this exact thing, and not about technology. So this is the other thing about the work we put in up front on the initiatives we put in our organizations, and are we actually doing the work to create the business case and create the value realization plan to say, here's how we're going to get the juice out of the lemon at the end, right? This is how we're going to get the value, because every single organization I know has implemented a CRM and is using 10% of what the CRM can actually do, right? With the intent that they thought it was going to change their world, right? But we don't do the work. So when you look at the stats, 70% of change initiatives fail, right? And fail means we put something in and we don't maximize what we're doing. We don't actually get a return on investment from it. And so when you look at that, how should organizations really be managing that change, right? Especially around technology, around anything that they're doing. Like, how are you helping? How are you seeing organizations that are doing it right? What are they doing to not fail?
I've often said, I've comically said that I'm going to write a book and I'm going to title it, "What the hell do I do with a skinned cat?" Right? We talk about all these different ways to come up with a skinned cat, but what are you supposed to do it? Like, to the point that you just made, Jamie, what are we trying to accomplish? If we're putting in a new CRM, do we know why? Yes, it's a collection of good data, but do we know what we're trying to accomplish with that? Is the old way of doing it bad enough that it warrants a new way of doing it, right? We don't spend enough time thinking about those questions. We just typically tend to move very fast into an execution standpoint. And this project gets a life on its own and starts gaining this momentum before anybody can call time out and say, have we thought about these things? And that's not an accusation. That's not a finger pointing. It's just we're at an opportunity now. I think personally, just my own observations, the COVID pandemic really exposed this kind of approach to how we do technology implementation, certainly, but certainly even in a broader scope, how we do organizational management, right? We have forgotten that there is a huge and tremendous benefit of taking time up front to unpack the why question as to what this is going to benefit, how this is going to benefit us. To your question about how am I seeing organizations do this well, it's as simple as they are taking the time not only to ask these questions up front, but they're also prioritizing and committing to the results that are coming out of those question sessions, right? If I develop a strategy and it looks good on paper, why wouldn't I prioritize that? Why wouldn't we commit to that? Why wouldn't we allocate resources to that? And subsequently, I know that a lot of things will happen over time in a lot of different organizations, fires pop up and so forth. But when the fire's put away, right, when that urgent thing is quieted, is this still a priority? Is this still the thing that we're trying to accomplish? And are we allocating it and behaving like this is the thing we're trying to accomplish?
Right. And that's where I really tie it to, and we'll get to more of the culture pieces, right? So we define culture as the way you think, act, and interact as an organization, right? So it's every day, every moment, it's those interactions. And so when you think about technology is a huge part of that interaction now, right? It plugs in, it creates the collaboration. And how are you seeing organizations use technology to actually increase their culture, right? Make their culture a more positive place? Like, what is that tie that you're seeing?
Yeah. Again, this goes back to when I talked about COVID, right? Virtually every organization, certainly in the US and definitely around the world, everybody utilized technology almost overnight. We implemented solutions we didn't even know we had, or they were still in the box, and we hurried up and got them going. What I'm seeing now, the technology worked. We were able to connect, we were able to collaborate, we were able to continue to do work. What I'm seeing now is a lot of organizations pushing the pause button, or at least pumping the brakes and saying, okay, let's stop, let's think very deeply about what we just did over the last 2.5 years. Is this right? Is this best? How do we utilize this? How do we implement this? How do we strategically leverage this as a differentiator, right? Not just as a means to get something done, but how do we leverage this as a differentiator? And that requires a lot of planning. And one of the things that I have seen, I've been in technology for the past 30 years, and one of the things that has bothered me, if I could ever get on my soapbox and talk about it, right, is that technology has been relegated to the IT department, right? A lot of times when we talk about innovation and we think about this, we immediately assign somebody from the IT department to get this stuff done. Your IT department, for those of you that are CEOs or execs that are on the call, your IT department is specifically designed to accomplish very particular tasks within your organization. It has to do with technology implementation, has to do with data transport, it has to do with security, it has to do with a lot of these different things. The fact that they're wrapped under this thing called technology is just kind of a housing area for where they go inside the organization. Technology has to have organizational ownership. It's an absolute must. And in 2023 and beyond, that is one of the, if I could admonish leaders in any way, I would say that you have to commit to organizational ownership of technology. It's not just an IT thing. It's an organizational thing.
And this, again, parallels to how we talk about culture. Culture is also not an HR thing, right? So I think this is I'm in the midst of starting a leadership book, that this is going to be a big piece of it. I've got it in the outline, because leaders don't, with the pace of change, they're saying the next 5 years, there's going to be more change in terms of consumer behavior, right? Digital transformation, and more than the last 40 combined. So I think there are a lot of leaders that are like, whew, we made it through the last 2.5 years. When can we coast again? And it's like, there's no coasting coming, right? Like the pace of change, it just continues to get faster and faster. And so it's, instead of being overwhelmed, we've got to figure out how to manage it better. And I think that starts with each of us as leaders, no matter what our title is, no matter where we sit in the organization, understanding these things are our choice. Culture is my choice as a leader. When I walk into the office, when I walk, into my team meeting, what kind of culture do I want to create? What kind of impact do I want to create? I think technology, the use of technology, right? All of these things, it's not necessarily, like you said, relegated to the team that's supposed to own it. They're the ones that enable it, maybe, and support it and do some of the heavy lifting. But as leaders, we have to come together and talk about the real value of what we're trying to do, and know that we're all trying to solve the same problem. Because that's the biggest struggle I have right now is, again, I just had this conversation last week, $100,000 technology in a client, and they're sitting around talking about how it's not being utilized correctly. And I asked them, I said, so what was the original business case for this technology, right? You spent $100,000. What were you trying to do with it? And everyone just stares at each other. And it's not because they're not smart people, but they never went through the work of saying, here's what it's going to do. It's going to create an efficiency here. We're going to be able to reduce a position here, right? Whatever it's going to do. And then no one ever comes back to check on that. And that's why I think it gets a bad rap, because they look at the tech team and they say, this didn't work, when really the business leaders didn't do the work. No offense to all the business leaders on the call, but they didn't do the work, right?
Well, and it's so easy. And again, I know where you're coming from on this. So this isn't an accusation. This is an opportunity to kind of step back and do the bigger picture of this, right? Take something simple. Take a common technology implementation off Microsoft Office 365. Many organizations are probably on that, or maybe heading towards that, right? That's a very common technology implementation. You mentioned CRM earlier, very common technology implementation. We tend to think that it's going to be as easy as pulling it out of the box, spinning it up, getting the right securities, kind of tweaking it to make it towards, fit our business, and then we just roll. But we don't think about the job description changes that go along with that. We don't think about the processes that need to be changed according to that. We don't think about the policy and the resulting cultural impacts that go along with this. One of the things, and I know in the last organization I was with, we had across the organization, we talked about content managers at multiple levels across the organization. Prior to, one division owned quote unquote content management. They were responsible for pushing it forward and managing and curating and so forth. But when we look at what technology enables us to do, we've now found content managers at virtually every level within the organization. That sounds great. It can create additional bandwidth and certainly other opportunities or other advantages. But who's going to do the training for that? If you were hired as an analyst, if you were hired as an engineer, or if you were hired as a clerk, and now suddenly you have other duties as assigned is now content management. Do we compensate you differently for that? Do we change your job description for that? Do we look for new talent coming for that? What's the onboarding process? What's the ramp up time? Like those are things that really come into play when we look at technology. And I'll take a breath here, but every technology implementation has two sides to it. There is a very, very clear technical side to a technology implementation or a technology initiative. And then there is the cultural side to that technology initiative. It is people, processes, and culture. And if you're not factoring those things into your overall project or overall initiative, you're absolutely going to hit points of frustration. You're going to run into collision points. You're going to run into challenges that in some cases may be insurmountable.
Right. And it can have a huge impact. I'm going to open it up. I said I was going to kind of do questions, little kind of pause points throughout this, but while people are thinking, so feel free to unmute if you've got a question, statement, even knowledge to share. It doesn't have to be just Mike and I kind of sharing this, but I think back to my early tech days, right? My role, and the reason I had such a global role was it was around enterprise transformation. And it was in the time when we were bringing in tech and replacing an entire plant system. Right. And success meant we got the entire plant system and the plant was now running on a new technology, except for that really wasn't where the success came in, because where we fell down was on the human energy. Yeah. Right? Because we could put in the most glamorous tech in the plant. And if the humans weren't on board with it, even if they knew how to do it and they weren't on board with it, or it made their lives harder and they didn't understand why, right? Or they, came in every day and couldn't get the data that they needed. That's the culture aspect that you're talking about. That is what's so important here, is that we've got to factor that into all change, but specifically technology change, because technology can be the enabler as long as we bring the people along, right, on the ride with us.
Absolutely.
So, are there any questions? Again, want to just open it up and kind of have a dialogue, pick Mike's brain and his experience. So go ahead and unmute, pop them in the chat.
While we're waiting on that,
go ahead,
good friend,
Scott.
good for.
Oh, Scott.
Who's that? Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I thought I'd start off here. So, Mike, Jamie, either way, CRM example, right? I'm working with a company. They're rolling out a CRM, and they are now to that time where they're trying to figure out, okay, now we've got it out here. We've got some training on it. How and now they're struggling on getting people to adopt it and use it on a regular basis. So, Mike, Jamie, best practices, past experience, et cetera. What would be some words of wisdom, if you would, that I could actually share with them for an approach to take? We're coming up on annual planning next week with them, and I want to make sure that this has been a critical component for this year, a success factor that we needed to roll out. So now, how do we continue to get the implementation? Just want to, since it's specifically on tech, love your input on that.
Yeah, I want Mike to answer this, but I also want to just say, I would be a bazillionaire if I could figure out how to make CRM rollouts effective. Like every single company I've ever known struggles with this, so they are not alone. That doesn't make them feel any better, I'm sure, but that space is it's a hard one. So Mike, what guidance would you give?
Yeah, Scott, just to be clear, did you say it's already live and they're rolling, or they're in the adoption side of this?
Correct.
So what I would do, I think one of the errors that a lot of organizations will fall into is trying to swing for the fence. How do we make the entire thing better? How do we fix the entire thing? Find either the most pressing issue or a quick win, one of the two, right? But concentrate either on either side of those. If there is a critical issue that is preventing it from doing what it needs to be doing, like again, critical function, you got to focus in on that. If everything is kind of sort of maybe working already and you just want to refine it, find the quick win. But don't try to swing for the fence. Don't try to bite off too much. Get everybody focused in around that, because you'll have opportunity to look at a lot of different exercises that you're taking the team through as you either dig into the critical side or you dig into the quick win. But that would be my first advice is either identify if it's a critical issue, or two, if everything's kind of sort of moving forward, identify that quick win and dive into that.
And
Okay.
I have a whole bunch of ideas, Scott, so would be happy to have a conversation after this too. My mind goes to stakeholder management first off.
Yeah.
And stakeholder management is something, and this is the conversation I had with this company that had rolled this out and isn't getting the value from it, is typically you want to do that ahead of time so that it is something, and we have tools, I'd be happy to share them with anybody who wants, like a true stakeholder management plan. Like, how do we think through the stakeholders? What's their impact on the change? Like forcing yourself to go through that up front, because how accounting is impacted might look different, right, than how business facing, customer facing people are impacted. And so you've got to kind of sit down and think about that, because your messaging and how you roll it out to them is different. You can still do that now, right? So even though it's not working as you plan, I'd still sit down and say, who are our key stakeholders here? And it might be even down to Joe in sales is a more critical stakeholder than Jill. And we need to spend some time with Joe and get him in closer, because he's the one that's causing the problem. I mean, sometimes it's a single person that is such an influence that until we slow down and say, that's where we need to focus our energy, is getting Joe on board. That can go a long way. So there's a lot of change management and stakeholder management tools in there. The other thing that we highly recommend, and this is what I did with this team last week, is really talked about commitment. So the 5 dysfunctions of a team. I know many of you on the call have read that book, right? It's a great book. The pyramid that just talks about how you gain commitment, accountability is through positive conflict and trust, right? And what that means is when you're implementing something big, I always recommend focus groups, things up front to bring people in, even if they don't have a decision on what CRM we're choosing, bring people into groups early to make them feel like they have a say. Their voice has been heard in the conversation. That's a huge cultural impact. So if we can do that even now and just sit down and say, doesn't feel like it's going as well, right, as we wanted it to, maybe there's some conversations, and how do we gain that commitment? Because the only way as humans that we're fully committed to something is if our voice has been heard, right? So we got to create the space for people's voice to be heard. And I think a lot of leaders feel like they have to do the work and then just tell people what they need them to do. And it's really the opposite. We got to bring them in early and often so that they can do the work instead of us having to.
Right. Yeah. People support. Yeah, absolutely. People support what they help create. So if you're willing to share that stakeholder management, that'd be helpful, Jamie.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I've got some good items I can take away and roll out next week. So thanks, Michael and Jamie.
Yeah. Scott, Jamie made a comment about the stakeholder management. I think another opportunity, there's an opportunity here also to engage the stakeholders and find out why is this thing not working. If it's a critical function, why is it? Is it not functioning because of a technical component? Is it not functioning because of a legacy process that maybe now there's the opportunity to either unhinge or refine that process? Or is it because there's an education or training component? Finding out why and digging in, spending the time finding out why it's not working could end up just being somebody's preference. It could be a technical component. It could be a legacy process. There's a lot of things that are wrapped up into that, but spend the time asking why.
And don't just assume people just are coming in every day not wanting to use the system, right? I think as leaders, we just assume like they're just trying to make it hard. They're not. There's some obstacle, like Mike's saying, there's some obstacle, some block for them that as leaders, our job is to remove the block so that they behave the way we want them to behave, right?
Right.
So Jake, just so everybody knows, the 5 dysfunctions of a team, Patrick Lencioni, I put it in the chat. Thanks, Jake, for asking that question and clarifying. So the book, if anybody's interested in that, it's I don't have it here. I call it a plane ride book. So super quick, stable. I've read it multiple times. Great, quick book. Oh, perfect. And Steph threw the link right to Amazon. Look at that. You can have it by the end of the day, probably on Amazon. So there you go, people. Service. Okay. So, and again, jump in if people have questions. We're at the point, just you can unmute and kind of jump in as we go. So I want you to talk about, Mike, I want you to talk about your track model. And I don't know if there's something maybe you can send out to people, because this is a lot of content too. Right after this, if people are interested, Steph can collect their names in the chat. But I want you to talk about this model you created and why, to kind of bridge this gap between technology and culture.
I would love to say there was a ton of science that went into it. I was just It was born out of frustration.
Right, real life, like blood, sweat, and tears. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Frustration is the mother of all innovation, right?
Yeah.
So I think really what it was born out of is a lot of times when we start an initiative, whether it's a technology initiative, whether it's a house building, whether it's any kind of campaign that we're trying to do, we almost always start off with a blank canvas. And for probably 99% of the population, a blank canvas is a scary thing. There's a burden that goes with it. There's a paralysis that goes with it. It's like, where do I start? And so I came up with the track model, one, because it formed a word, but two, because it's an umbrella term. These are 5 umbrella buckets that encompass virtually everything within an initiative. So the acronym is TRACK, and it stands for technology, relationships, adoption, culture, and knowledge. And from those 5 buckets, what happens is you're able to make sure it's almost like a checklist. On this initiative, do we have all of the technology pieces that are required to make this a success? Do we have all of the relationship pieces and elements that are necessary? What does adoption look like on the backside? That gets us thinking post-implementation and thinking longevity and sustainability. Culturally, what are the people, the processes, and culture that need to change or will be impacted by this? And then knowledge side, training, understanding, education, awareness. Do we have all of that in place? And these are 5 buckets that have many sub areas underneath them. But this is just kind of a mnemonic that helps prevents you from starting with a blank canvas, right? You've got these 5 areas, and certainly you can color beyond the lines, on that. But those 5 areas will help you encompass a lot and make sure that you're covering most, the majority of the ground you need to for any initiative.
And I hadn't made this connection before, but looking at these again, Mike, in the conversations we've had, is these are really aligned to basic human needs.
Yes.
Right? As fundamental as it is. Things like growth, right? Knowledge is growth, like control. When I have knowledge, I feel more in control of this chaos, right? That's happening, this change that's occurring. So this is what I look at this as we owe this to our people when we're asking them to do something different. And that's that disconnect again, not to get on my soapbox for a second time, but I will anyway. Is leaders just, we're so like, okay, what's the next thing? Okay, we need to do that. We move on. We don't take the time to say, are the people along for the ride with us, right? Have we even paid attention? Are they here with us? Or are they, I call it the marathon effect, right? We're out on mile 23, which is leaders. We need to be ahead of the rest of the organization, right? We want to be setting the pace and we want to have that vision. But how often do we turn around and say, oh, that person's still at the start line with their shoes untied. I should probably go back and make sure, right, they can keep up with us. There's something missing. And so that's why I love this holistic view that you take, is because it is just more. It's more than just the technology. It's how we get people there.
Yeah, and it's such a great point, is that we make an assumption. We, as an organization, we'll make an announcement that the XYZ project is launching on, whatever date it is. And we make an assumption that everybody is going to come along at the exact same pace and at the same scale. And that's, I don't know if anything can be more false, right? People learn in different ways. People have different motivations. People have different capacities and so forth. And certainly their priorities are different across the entire organization, right? So we have to create space to allow people to metabolize this in their way, in their respect. Dr. Kubler-Ross, she's very famous. She had done her research around grief and how people process grief. Well, over the years, looking at that, she was able to map that the exact same process that people go through in processing grief is the same thing that it's the same track that they go through in processing change. There's a shock, there's the announcement, there's denial, there's frustration, there's anger, and then ultimately there's adoption and integration, right? There is a new normal, but it takes people a time to kind of get to that new normal. When you think about, I worked as a CIO for a large police department, and I remember one of the major initiatives that we had going on. We had a lot of people who had been 20+ year employees who were going to be directly impacted by this technology change. And there was sadly, there was kind of a push to say, to make the assumption that they didn't want to make the change. It wasn't that they didn't want to make the change. They had cultural currency for being experts in this system that they've been working in for 20 plus years. We need to factor that in, right? That is it's valid, and it's very important to factor that in. It's not to say that we should keep the old system just because they're experts, but we should understand culturally what that means to them in their positional value and cultural value and organizational value as they begin to metabolize and learn a new system. It's going to take them time to become the expert in the next thing. So those are critical factors that we got to bring into these equations.
Okay, so just a couple of terms I'm totally ripping off. Metabolize the change, like that is exactly what it is, right? You've got to have the time for your body. I mean, it really is. It's your body to react, your mind to react, and to be able to metabolize it. And then cultural currency.
Yeah.
This is something that we are running into as an enormous issue right now with the generational shifts, right? Is we have knowledge in an organization that is safe in that knowledge, right? They love the safety and security, especially after the last 2.5 years. And this is not to stereotype every generation, right? But the boomers, they've been through it. They've got a lot of wisdom and knowledge to share, and they really like the stability based on where they're at in life, right? It's really hard to say, now we want to rock that entire boat and we just expect you to be as agile and nimble as Gen Z and the millennials. And it's literally not going to happen. So we're fighting a fight that we're not going to win, instead of creating the space, valuing their cultural currency and how can they actually help us drive the change, because they're a whole different stakeholder group that could help make this change really powerful. But instead we lump them, right? We don't utilize, I guess, their cultural currency. I love that aspect.
I think you bring up another good point too, is that organizationally and collectively as a leadership team, we view that opposition as a fight, right? The technology is not moving, the project is not moving, or whatever, it's not moving as forward as fast as we want, and we view that as a fight. That is a wrong position to take. I rarely say things are wrong. That is a wrong and errant position to take. Put yourself on the same side of the table as the people who are in the organization that are imperative to this initiative, to this campaign, and find ways to collaborate and move together as opposed to just being oppositional toward it. A good friend, Dave Snowden, who is very well known in the knowledge management space, said many years ago, he said, technology is designed to augment our human experiences, not replace them. And we have to remember that on the receiving end of every piece of technology solution we have is a living, breathing human being. And if we don't understand the gamut of where that human being can swing from, they had a bad day, they had a bad car, drive into work, their kid is sick. If we don't understand the gamut of what they can play, we're going to miss a lot of opportunities to create cheerleaders into the organization, champions of these initiatives and so forth, and find economies, right? Find really, really good economies. Last thing I'll say on this is you made a comment earlier, and when we start talking about cultural changes, whatever that looks like, however that's kind of introduced into the organization, right? If we just talk about change and we talk about culture, we talk about that, it becomes a very subjective conversation. It's my opinion versus your opinion. It's the book you read versus the one I read. It's the conference I went to versus the one you went to. Where's the right, wrong on this? When we start talking about technology through this lens of being very directive, very prescriptive, very strategic about it, it becomes an objective conversation, and almost always comes back to a cost standpoint, not just a dollars cost, but a time cost, an energy cost, a cultural cost, an organizational cost, an influence cost, a market share cost. All of those things play into it, and it becomes a very objective conversation very, very quickly. And we always talk and hear organizations talk about return on investment. And one of the things that these conversations allow us to do is talk about return of value. And where is the value of people in the organization? Where's the value of technology in the organization? Where's the value of culture in the organization? And how are we leveraging those to get, to accomplish what we're trying to do in the marketplace? Right.
So back to Scott's example. So what if this company, 2 weeks before they kicked off this big technology implementation, what they're trying to do, sat down with stakeholder groups and talked about return on value? Here's what we're trying to accomplish. What do you guys think this could add value to the organization, right? And then shut up as a leader, let them talk, right? Just that conversation alone would change their entire view of whatever you're trying to implement, because they're part of it. You've actually asked a different question because they've never thought about what the value of this tool is. Somebody's just telling them they have to do it, right? So when we create the space for these conversations, we save ourselves heartache, time, blood, sweat, and tears, whatever ends up on the other end, right? Of not getting where we need to get to because we didn't do the work up front, right? We didn't create that space for the conversation. And I love that tech is designed to augment the human experience versus replace it, like that whole concept, because many of you probably remember pre-COVID, 5-7 years ago, automation in the manufacturing space right, was a fear. That was a word that was feared because everybody thought they were going to lose their jobs, right? To machines, right? To machines doing things themselves and being run by tech. Look at where we're at now, right? We've got manufacturers that can't even run lines because they can't staff them. And so, but yet having that idea of tech is going to allow people career paths. I just had this conversation with a manufacturer and their annual planning is you're allowing a machinist to say, you no longer have to push that button and do those manual things. We're going to teach you how to run the software on the machine. And you have now skilled up, right? You've leveled up your thinking, your skill set, your future potential, because we're taking those manual aspects out. And that's the beautiful part of technology. Yeah. And you're probably seeing that too, is it can actually elevate the thinking in our organization.
Well, the other thing too that goes, just right alongside of what you're saying is as we go beyond 2023, one of the things that we are seeing is that technology allows organizations to replace task level, repeatable task level activities with automation. Mm-hmm. But when we value employees as only, if the only value an employee has is their ability to perform a task, we're missing the bigger aspect of this. And so thought leadership is one of the things that we're going to start to see growing in a tremendous volume over the next several years. And those individuals who are within your organization who may be task oriented right now, as you move them out and up into thought leadership roles, you gain the efficiency through automation, through automating those tasks, and then you're able to compensate your previous task runners in thought leadership now and delivering more strategic value for the organization. What's interesting, World Economic Forum in 2020, I think it was in 2020, put out a report that said between 2020 and 2025, 87 million jobs in the United States were either going to disappear or be displaced. That's known job title, known job description, solving known problems. In the same time frame, 95 million new jobs were going to be created. Mm-hmm. That's new job title, new job description, solving unknown problems. The challenge is that the 87 million jobs that are displaced may not have the necessary immediate requisite skills to fill those 97 million jobs or 95 million jobs that are created. This is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for organizations to rethink, to leverage technology, to change and layer culture on top of that, and then to make advances in how they are getting work done, again, in the marketplace.
Right. And it goes back to that value word that you said, is the value just looks different. It doesn't mean there's not value, right? That's what's really evolving. That's a beautiful way to think about it. Couple of questions. Scott posted another Patrick Lencioni book. Scott and I are Patrick Lencioni, yeah, I think he's president of the fan club and I'm vice president. So I love that book that he posted, and he's certified in that assessment that he posted. So reach out to him.
That's great.
Super interesting, brand new assessment that they just posted. And then Sarah asked, can you share that name again? And sorry, I didn't capture it when we were, which name, Sarah?
The name of the doctor who you were describing talks about grief.
Certainly.
Thank you.
It's Kubler-Ross, Kubler-Ross. And just look up grief curve or change curve.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep, I put it in the chat there too. Perfect. Okay, you guys, let's open it back up to questions. And then I've got a couple last ones for Mike kind of towards the end, and we're going to make sure we wrap this. I hate these sessions that go like right until you have another meeting. So we're going to plan to wrap 5 minutes early, but other questions, comments, anything else you want to share?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hey guys, I'm Sarah Hoops. I'm with MentorMate. I have a question regarding if we oftentimes will get the opportunity to come into a company through an RFP. So we are only talking to maybe the first stakeholder who's running that process. How do we start to get that culture and that people connection early on, before we have the opportunity to go sit with them and really meet them?
Jamie, I know you'll have thoughts on this. I'll let you go first.
Well, I do, but this is because Sarah and I have had a discussion around this about kind of what we do and what they do, and the value of what MentorMate does and the transformation they do for really large companies. So you can look them up, but they do some really, really cool stuff with big organizations. And the conversation Sarah and I have had and other members of the MentorMate team are kind of what I said before, right? Is that we're not doing that upfront work to assess stakeholders. Even the big companies aren't good at this, right? They're just like, we paid for the technology. We want you to come in and do this. Like, what's the time frame and how quick can you get it in? And to everything Mike has said today, I think as a service provider, Sarah, all of us, right, that provide services into companies like this, I truly think it's a differentiator for us to show up and say, hey, we got the technology thing down. Like, we can absolutely help you rock that piece of what you're trying to do. But what we also do is help you ensure you get the return on value and you get the change that you're expecting, because the technology itself cannot produce that change. And are you ready, right? And it might be a Cargill, right, where I was at, where they have a whole team that helps with this. Awesome. Let's figure out how to engage them in this work we're doing so they can help you guys get the full return. I just think, and again, there's probably going to be some that are like, nope, we just need you to implement the technology. It's going to happen. But I think having that conversation up front, just like we're having here today, could be a huge differentiator for partner companies, right? Service providers, to just say, we're going to do it different because we're actually in it with you. We don't want you to just pay us for technology and then we walk away and you don't actually get the value from it. I think it's changing the dialogue is my guidance. And I know that's not something super specific, but I do think there's an opportunity to differentiate in that way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You know, the challenge with RFPs is they are, just by nature, they're designed to be transactional, right? They put you into a very narrow path of answering their questions because they're trying to level set as if everybody's solution is going to be the same, and it's not. So just by nature of RFPs, unless you're doing like roadway paving, I don't know anything about roadway paving, but unless you're doing something very, very mechanical like that, when you're talking about impacting organizational operations, organizational efficiency and organizational autonomy, and even organizational experience, an RFP is just a bad fit sometimes. And unfortunately, procurement offices, they don't know how to get it. They don't know how to save themselves from themselves on that. But what I would say is, if you've already won the RFP, that's a tremendous opportunity to start having those conversations and seeding it in with whomever and whenever you can. If you're in the process of competing on an RFP, take what they give you, right? And meaning, if you get to talk to the procurement office as your first level, begin sounding different from all of the other competition. You're still going to answer the RFP exactly the way they want you to, but you're going to begin asking other questions that probably they haven't asked already on themselves. And because of that, and I'm saying this as a former practitioner sitting on the customer side of RFPs, when I see responses, one that can kind of check all the boxes, but then I see kind of ancillary information or ancillary questions or things like that that are really thought-provoking, that just in my mind elevates that respondent to a higher level within the list. So take what they give you, and then as you have those conversations, your questions, especially as you branch out, your questions will force them to pull other people into the conversation, because procurement doesn't know everything, right? If you start asking cultural questions, chances are they're not going to be able to answer that, but they're going to end up having to pull in the right people into that, and you'll just be able to make a different impact on them.
Yeah. Awesome question though.
Yeah.
Other
Thank
questions?
you.
Can I give people some to, yeah.
Hi, this is Leilani. Good
Leilani.
morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm curious your thoughts around the impacts of leadership being incredibly clear and specific on communicating their strategy across all employees, and that being tied into the measures of success around some of these big changes. Because I do feel like sometimes in engagements, the strategy or the direction of the company or also guidelines around what they're not willing to do from a strategic standpoint can be a really big impact on overall success of like adoption and like employees being clear, right, on their direction and where they're headed and what their role and responsibility might be in any of these types of initiatives.
Yeah, so this is Leilani, this is another one of those. I could be a bazillionaire if I could figure out how to effectively get culture all the way down through an organization, or get strategy all the way down through an organization, because it typically makes it 1 or 2 levels and then kind of gets diluted, right? And people don't really understand it. And so back to some of the things we've talked about before, but I think it's each leader's choice to ensure they understand it and they know how to articulate it in crayons and paper, right? As simply as possible for their people. And how do we tie the day-to-day work? I don't mean to keep saying I just had this conversation, but I just had this yesterday, is we've started taking most of our clients, and there's another great book, not to overbook everybody here today. I wasn't planning on that, but Turning the Flywheel by Jim Collins. It's literally, I think it's 60 pages. Like, it's the fastest read to read it in an hour. And Jim Collins is good to great, right? One of the best business minds. Scott, I think I got you onto that as well. And we started talking about their flywheel, which is how they create momentum in the business and maintain momentum. And then your strategy sits above the flywheel and improves aspects of the flywheel. But what I'm starting to realize is when we talk about the flywheel, which is the day-to-day business activities and interactions and levers, that's how we actually drive the strategy down to the ground. Because people in accounting, someone in accounting can say, I understand how I impact the flywheel, right? Positively or negatively based on what I do or don't do. And so we're starting to take strategy, actually articulate it based on the different stages of the flywheel, and then having conversations with lower levels of the organization to say, how do you now see yourself, right, playing in this, so that it's not the strategic plan they need to understand, because I think that's really hard. It's more of the day-to-day momentum and how they play into that. That's what we're seeing is hugely successful.
No, good points, Jamie. And Leilani, good question. You know, never, Jamie, to your point, never underestimate the power of a big cheap tablet and crayons, right?
Yeah.
So I think what's important around the question that you're asking is this notion of commitment, right? Wherever you make the commitment, there should also be a prioritization, and there should also be resources allocated to fulfill that commitment, right? And a lot of times, especially with technology projects, we talk about go live, right? Everything is driven towards go live, as if go live is the end of the story, right? There is so much more that happens beyond that, and we should be talking about these projects in terms of total cost of ownership and almost total time of ownership, right? What happens on day 1 is going to look very different than what happens on day 101 or day 1001. But we never talk about that. We talk about training, right? I mean, how many projects have you been in where the training curriculum is 40 hours of train the trainer, right? As if somebody can fully come up to speed in 40 hours and then train the entire organization on that, right? So we're thinking about this wrong. The other thing that I will say is that when a commitment is made, virtually everyone within the organization, especially at the lowest line levels, who will feel the impacts of this the most, they are going to challenge that commitment. It's not because they don't want to do work. It's not because they don't want to change. They're actually testing your resolve. Are you truly committed to doing this? And are you really going to prioritize this? And are you really going to resource this? And are you really going to help implement this? You know, not to say that this is a formula for it, but how many organizations implement something? I mentioned, Office 365 earlier, or a new CRM. How many organizations implementing either one of those technologies have updated annual performance evals to include a metric that says you have to accomplish X, or you have to receive this much, have this much acumen on this, or this much proficiency. We don't see this hardly in any organization. But if you are now holding me accountable to learning the new XYZ system that we just implemented, I now have a vested interest in learning this, and that helps push this down and helps everybody understand this. Again, that's one example, but you're asking a profound question that many organizations, and sadly too many, don't answer or don't even address. So perfect thought.
Yeah, and this is a whole nother webinar that we go around. Something I tell clients is they want to know how I can tell the health of their organization. I say I follow the metrics. I can tell you how accountable your organization is when you tell me what metrics that people have to measure. Right now, 5 minutes, I'll tell you how accountable you are, because the metrics is what's driving the behavior, right? Humans are naturally wired to achieve. And if we give them metrics and tell them, here's where the line's at, here's what we expect, they typically will rise to the occasion. But we don't do that. Either we don't know how to measure, or we feel like that's micromanagement, when really we're helping them win the week, right? Well, we're helping them win. How do they know what winning actually looks like unless they have metrics? So again, whole nother maybe we should do that in the new year, Mike.
Yeah, sounds good.
On that. Okay, I want you to just wrap, Mike. And again, we can stay on if people want to stay on. So if there's other questions or you want to pop them in the chat, but we talked about a lot here. And I just want you to just like last words of wisdom and advice. This is a lot of information. Where do we start? How do we get better as leaders?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is just remember technology is a tool. It is not an end unto itself. It is merely a resource. And like any other resource, if you don't wrap a strategy around it, it will own you versus you owning it, right? I think that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is from a leader's perspective, you have to commit to organizational ownership of any technology initiative, and not just the initiative itself, not just go live, but what technology is supposed to be doing and helping your organization accomplish. That has to be ownership, organizational ownership on that. And then the last thing that I will say is remember that there are always two sides to every technology initiative. There is a very clear technical side, and that's the easy part. We can always look at that and resource to that. There is a cultural side, people, processes, and culture, that we too often dismiss or just simply don't even think about or don't account for. And that has greater impact on the overall success of any technology that we're doing. And the cultural piece of that is how that moves forward. And that's how that's going to control behavior within your organizations.
Yeah. It's a great way to end this conversation.
Yeah.
I wanted to throw this back up here so that you have Mike and I's contact info. So let me throw that up on the screen so that you've got it. Instagram, both of us, put good content out. LinkedIn, we're always sharing articles. We're always sharing each other's stuff. So follow us there as well, and Keystone, our organizations as well. We will also send out, and Steph will capture the chat and send out the links for the books and all of that kind of stuff. We recorded this. So if there's someone else in your organization, you're like, hey, listen to this. This is what we're talking about, right? Or we're trying to get better at, feel free to share it. Should be open for anybody else to listen to. And then one last thing, because I'm horrible at plugging anything we're doing, but I'll have Steph put it in the email follow-up, is hopefully by early January, we are in pre-sale for our book, The Culture Climb. It'll be out in June, but we're starting, Amazon will be live in pre-sale, they think early January. So we'll send out the link to that as well, because that's a lot of what we've been talking about here is how do you look at culture differently, right? And how do you start to explain culture differently in your organization so that the average leader can kind of grasp it and understand it. So would love to have you guys, we'll probably do something about that and have a webinar kind of closer to launch date on that and talk a little bit more about culture. But Mike and I are here. We'll hang on for a few minutes if people want to stay and have conversations, but we just appreciate you guys being part of this conversation, especially this time of year. This is a group of people that clearly want to end the year strong and kick off January 2023 strong as well. So appreciate all of you being here today.
Yeah. Happy holidays to everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie, Mike.